Welcome to the congregation of Yahweh. Greetings to those on the internet or those that might be, well, I guess we're not watching live today, but today is the day of Pentecost, which most of the world out there has no clue what's going on, and it's just life as usual. And I want to go over a few scriptures as to why the masses don't care about the significance of Pentecost, and then I'll touch on a few things that are a little bit deeper, the deeper meanings, the significance of Pentecost, and what it possibly lines up with in Scripture. But the first verse that comes to mind when I talk to people or when the subject of feast days comes up is Colossians chapter 2. And we'll cover that briefly in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14. Having blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, he has taken it out of the way, nailing it to his stake or to his cross. And everybody wants to nail something to the cross. They either want to nail the Mosaic law to the cross, all the writings of Moses, or they want to nail the Old Testament, the whole book, to the cross. But it's very easy to understand what was actually nailed there. And it's the verse right before it. And you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he did make alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. It's that simple. What was nailed to the stake were our transgressions. And the curse for our transgressions with it, which is the death sentence. It actually, if we let the Bible speak for itself, it says he became sin for us who knew no sin, and he became a curse for us. So there it is. Both the sin and the curse for sin was nailed up there. And his instructions were never against us. They're never against his people until you break them. Obedience to his commandment brings blessing and health and being free from the diseases. There were nothing but blessings were attached to his commandments. But since they were our transgressions, that is why they were against us. And if we continue on, and it's obvious from the context here in verse 13, it says, the uncircumcision of your flesh. He's talking to the Gentiles. He's talking to those of the nations who have come in and are starting to fellowship and learn from Israel. More on that in a few minutes. But it also says in verse 17, well, back it up to 16. Let no man judge you, therefore, in meat or in drink or in respect of a feast day or of new moons or of a Sabbath day, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Messiah. Now, why would he tell Gentiles not to let anyone judge you? And what he's saying here is when you come in and keep these things, don't let the world judge you for your obedience. And the word is in italics, the body is of Messiah, is actually not there in the original text. It actually says, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body of Messiah. Now, what mainstream interpretation of that is the Messiah is the body, and the feast days cast a shadow, and since the body came, we have no need for the shadow. That's not what it's saying at all. He's actually finishing up a thought from verse 16. Let no one judge you but the body of Messiah. We judge things inside the body. And that's a repetitious theme from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Another verse that comes to mind is Ephesians chapter 2. And of course, I think some people call it cherry picking, when you just take one verse and create a whole doctrine or mindset over one verse, not taking into consideration the context in which it was written. But in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. You see, he abolished in his flesh all of the law of Moses, or the whole Old Testament. Again, this is another verse taken out of context. In verse 11, tells us who he's referring to here. Therefore, remember that you once were Gentiles in the flesh. He's talking to the Gentiles again. And this was a big deal because those of the nations that were considered unclean were coming in, and they didn't know what to do with these people. And some was like, oh, you need to circumcise them and make them keep everything, and then we might let them in. But there was a big debate and a dispute about that, and that's in Acts chapter 15. And the conclusion of the matter was they need to stop doing these 4 things immediately, and they'll learn from Moses in the synagogues on the Sabbath. That's Acts 15:21. A lot of people that they'll use those verses there to say, the Gentiles are only bound to keep 4 laws. Well, if that's the case, then they can murder and commit adultery and steal and all that. Those aren't listed in those 4 things. So that reasoning is very, very weak. But it says in Ephesians chapter 2 that when you were Gentiles, in verse 12, you were separate from the Messiah. You were aliens from the citizenship of Israel, and you were strangers from the covenants of promise. You had no hope, and you were without Yahweh in the world. So in your Gentile state, you're lost. But then he goes on to say in verse 19, but now in the Messiah, you're no longer strangers and sojourners, but you're fellow citizens. You become one with Israel. And this unification of 2 groups of people into one is a repetitious theme found all throughout Scripture. But I'm not going to get into that right now. Romans chapter 14, another weak interpretation to disregard the commandments. Romans chapter 14 and verse 5 says, and it's funny, anytime somebody wants to debate about the observance of these things, it's always one verse. One verse here and one verse there, and no context surrounding the verses. But in verse 5, one man esteems one day above another, another esteems every day. Let every man be fully assured in his own mind. He that regards the day to Yahweh, and he that eats, he eats to Yahweh, for he gives Elohim thanks. And he that eats not, to Yahweh he eats not, and gives thanks. So, the way that's interpreted, if you want to keep it, you can. And if you don't, you don't have to. If Paul was actually talking about the feast days here, he would be worthy of death, according to the Father's own instructions. So, we know that the interpretations of this Romans verse and Ephesians verse and the Colossians verse and any other verse in the Messianic Scriptures from Matthew to Revelations, if the writer was writing to forsake the commandments, to disregard the commandments, he was worthy of death. It was false. That would be false. So we know that there has to be a different interpretation that is in harmony. And I want to go back to one verse that I missed in Ephesians chapter 2 real quick. When he's talking about I sure do got a lot of wind up here. I'll get over it. All right. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 19, so then you are no more strangers and sojourners, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of Yahweh, being built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, the Messiah Yeshua himself being the chief cornerstone. It says that we are being built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Well, most want to do away with the prophets, the writings of the prophets. And in Matthew chapter 5, I love to cover this, and I'm sure many people in here have heard this several times, but I find it quite significant. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its flavor, with what shall it be salted? It is from then on good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, neither do men light a lamp, but put it under a bushel, but on the stand, and it shines to all that are in the house. Even so, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Now the next few scriptures here, I've used those scriptures for years. But it was actually within the past couple years that I made the connection that the salt and the light and the good works are exactly what he's about to talk about in the next verse. Think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. That is the good works that need to shine so that men can glorify our Father in heaven. And it reminds me, back in Deuteronomy, it says, when the nations, the Gentiles, when they see you doing this law, they will say, oh, what a wise and understanding people this is. It was his instructions that set his people apart from the heathen. And when the heathen saw how great these laws were, they would glorify him for it. So this is the light that is to shine, the good works that's found in the law and the prophets. Then he goes on to say, for truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law until all things be accomplished. Till heaven and earth pass away. As long as the earth is still standing, the earth is still here and the heavens are still here, every stroke of the pen in the Father's instructions are to remain intact. Whosoever therefore shall break one of the least commandments and shall teach men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So that's how you test a false teacher and a false doctrine. What is his relationship to the commandments? Now somebody told me one time, this is the 10 commandments. That's not talking about that other feast day and dietary mumbo jumbo. It's only the 10 commandments. Everything the Father tells you to do or not to do is a commandment. But the commandments he's referring to here is the ones found in the law and the prophets that he just spoke about. That's the context. And again, that is the good works. So now that we know, and if there be any other interpretation of Scripture that would lead us to believe that we're not supposed to observe these things, it's a false interpretation. From Genesis to Revelations is in complete harmony. Now, concerning this day, it's actually known by several things in Scripture. I'm going to go review those real quick. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 16. Exodus 23 and 16. And the feast of the harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you sow in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year. Of course, that's during Tabernacles times, but here it's referred to as the feast of the harvest. Chapter 34 and verse 22. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the sovereign Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel. For I will cast out nations before you, and enlarge your borders. Neither shall any man desire your land. When you go up to appear before Yahweh your Elohim 3 times in a year, you shall not offer the blood of any sacrifice with leaven, neither shall the sacrifice of the feast of Passover be left until the morning. The first of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of Yahweh. Maybe I think I might have wrote down the wrong.
34:22 maybe?
Yeah, I was looking for a different name. But I'll continue on. Numbers chapter 28. And verse 26. Also in the day of the first fruits, when you offer a new meal offering to Yahweh in your feast of weeks, you shall have a holy convocation, you shall do no servile work. So here, the day of first fruits during the feast of weeks, which Brother Anthony pointed out, day of Sabbaths. And Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 10. And you shall keep the feast of weeks to Yahweh your Elohim with a tribute of of a free will offering of your hand, you shall give according as Yahweh your Elohim blesses you. And the term is also found in Exodus chapter 20, and this is count 50, and it's known as Pentecost. That's in 20 and 16. For Paul had determined to sail past Ephesus that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost. It was urgent for Paul to get there. Okay. And also in Acts chapter 2, in verse 1. And when the day of Pentecost was now come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound of a rushing of a mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And I actually just learned this morning from a brother. It is in our mindset that they were in the upper room on Pentecost. And he pointed out to me that no, they weren't in the upper room, that they were at Jerusalem to keep the feast. And what was pointed out is in the last chapter, it does say that they were in the upper room. That's in verse 13 of chapter 1. And when they had come in, they went up into an upper chamber where they were remaining, both Peter, John, Jacob, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, etc., naming the disciples. But then when you look at, they cast lots for the disciples, and then in chapter 2 it says, and when the day of Pentecost was now come. So it looks like there's a time gap there. But that's just something to dig into. Now, the day of Pentecost, or Shavuot, is also the day that the law was spoken from Yahweh to Israel. And I think that there is a very deep significance. I personally see an image of the second coming between those events, and I'll touch on that here in just a minute. In Exodus chapter 19. Now, I'm not saying that Yeshua is going to return on Shavuot. It seems that he will more likely return on the Day of Trumpets or possibly Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is actually the last commanded day to blow a trumpet, and it says at the sound of the last trump. Possibly a connection there. In Exodus chapter 19, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came unto the wilderness of Sinai. When they had departed from Rephidim and had come to the wilderness of Sinai, they encamped in the wilderness, and there Israel encamped before the mount. And Moses went up to Elohim, and Yahweh called to him out of the mountain, saying, in this manner shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bear you on eagle's wings. Revelations talks about a group of people that fled from the flood on the wings of an eagle. I'm just going to show you some similarities here. And brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession from among all peoples, and also the remnant and revelations of those that keep the commandments. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We also see kings and priests in Revelations that reign with the Messiah. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and set before them all these words which Yahweh commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Moses, lo, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. And Moses told the words of the people to Yahweh. Yahweh said to Moses, go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments. Again, there's a group in Revelations that make their robes white with the blood of the Lamb. And be ready for the 3rd day, for the 3rd day Yahweh will come down in the sight of all the people upon the Mount Sinai, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you go not up to the mountain or touch the border of it. Whosoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether he be beast or man. He shall not live when the trumpet sounds long. There's that trumpet. They shall come up to the mount. And Moses went down from the mount to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their garments. And they said to the people, be ready by the third day, come not near a woman. And another thing that kind of ties in is it says in Revelations there was a group, they were virgins, and that's most likely not literal. Paul said that he was trying to present the church as a chaste virgin. Verse 16, and it came to pass on the third day, when it was morning, and there were thunders, lightnings, thick cloud on the mount, and the sound of the trumpet. These sounds here are also seen in the book of Revelations, and it says that the ark was seen in heaven. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet Elohim, and they stood at the lower part of the mount. And Mount Sinai, the whole of it smoked, because Yahweh descended on it in fire, and the smoke of it ascended as the smoke of a furnace. The whole mount quaked greatly, and when the voice of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and Elohim answered him by a voice. And Yahweh came down upon Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. Yahweh called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up, and Yahweh said to Moses, go down, warn the people lest they break through to Yahweh to gaze, and many of them die. And let the priests also that come near to Yahweh sanctify themselves, lest Yahweh break forth upon them. And Moses said to Yahweh, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain, sanctify it. And Yahweh said to him, go, get down, and you shall come up, you and Aaron with you, but let none of the priests and the people break through to come up to Yahweh, lest he breaks forth upon them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And then in chapter 20, he's actually speaking out loud the Ten Commandments. And then after the Ten Commandments were completed and he spoke them, they said, that's enough. We don't want to hear. Now, so here we have the nation of Israel coming to a mountain with their robes washed white, and they're preparing to hear the voice of Yahweh. And let's go to Isaiah chapter 2, and this is what I see here. And anybody, in the mainstream that has some of these strange doctrines out there about the second coming and how they perceive it, ask them how this verse fits into their theology. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 2, and it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of Yahweh's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. And many people shall go and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the Elohim of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. So at some point in time, in the latter days, there's going to be a mountain. The nations shall flow to the mountain, and they will be learning his word, his law. Where does that fit in with mainstream theology? It doesn't. They think that the law was done away with, but we see it. There's a time in the future when it will be taught to the nations. And I personally believe that that's going to be done by the kings and priests that reign with the Messiah for 1,000 years. The role of a king and a priest was to teach, to rule rightly by his instructions. And allegorically, I think that's seen when Moses was trying to rule over everybody by himself. Jethro said, what you're doing is not good. You need to choose out wise people full of wisdom and the Spirit, and let them rule the people for you. And the hard matters, they can bring to you. Now, behind the... here's another thing that ties in. In Matthew chapter 16, this is another picture, which I covered this recently. This is another picture of the second coming. I'll be closing out here in just a minute. Matthew chapter 16, the last two verses. In verse 27, For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then shall he render to every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of them that stand here who shall certainly not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That was a very hard to grasp what's going on here. He's saying there's some alive here who aren't going to die until they see till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So it's almost worded like somebody here is actually going to see me return. But what he's saying to them is there's some here who are about to see it in a vision. And the next chapter is exactly that. It is a vision of the second coming. Chapter 17, and after 6 days, Yeshua takes with him Peter, Jacob, John, and his brother. And it's interesting that, for a long time people have thought that the 6 days of creation and the seventh day of rest was an allegory of 6,000 years of man, and the seventh day, the millennium, being the messianic era when peace would be on the earth, which kind of is a good indicator as to why Satan is bound for 1,000 years. So after 6 days, he takes these three, brings them up to the mountain apart, and he was transfigured before them. His face did shine as the sun, and his garments became white as the light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, taking with, symbolically speaking, Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, talking with him. And Peter answered and said to Yeshua, Master, it is good for us to be here. If you will, I will make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was yet speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. The Messiah is returning in glory with his angels, with the law and the prophets, and the Father's going to say, Hear ye him. And the nations are going to flow to the mountain to hear what he has to say. And Yeshua came and touched them and says, Arise, be not afraid. And lifting up their eyes, they saw no one except Yeshua only. And as they were coming down from the mountain, Yeshua commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no man. And that's why he said they would see the kingdom, the Son of Man in his kingdom. And of course, they asked why the scribes say Elijah must come. And in verse 11, he said that Elijah indeed does come and shall restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah is come already, and they knew him not. And he was speaking of John the Baptist. Now, behind the feast, behind Passover, and behind Pentecost, and behind Tabernacles, there is a harvest going on. And, when I see the agricultural terms in the New Testament, the things about, sowing the field and the tares, and, he looked at the people, had compassion on the people, and said, look, the harvest is ripe. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And he was talking about the people. And this is just my theory. I believe that everybody before the Messiah was significant to the barley. Everybody after the Messiah is significant to the wheat. And in Revelation chapter 14, it talks about a final harvest where an angel comes in and gathers his elect. And then another angel comes in and gets a harvest and puts them into the winepress of his wrath. But, the significance of this day, one, we're supposed to just keep it because he said to. We don't have to have reasoning behind it. We do it because he said so. There's some commandments we do it just because Yahweh said do it, and we stay away from it just because Yahweh said stay away from it. We don't have to have an explanation or a reasoning, but we do see the significance. We can celebrate the day that the Spirit was poured out on the body of believers, and we can celebrate the day that Yahweh spoke his commandments to humanity, and praise Yahweh that we still have his word today. Let's just thank Yahweh for this day and look forward to, it says that it is a shadow of things to come. Future tense. Hallelujah.